rang my daughter's mobile telephone at 11:43 on a Tuesday night, and when she did not answer, he rang again. I have the call logs. I have all of it. Every call, every letter, every unannounced visit, every piece of paper that passed between his office and this cottage over the 9 months that followed. I kept it all in a lever arch file, in date order with tabs. I want to tell you about the document that arrived on the morning of the hearing, the one that nobody in that courtroom had seen before, the one that changed the shape of everything in approximately 11 minutes. But before I do that, I need you to understand what 9 months of sustained harassment does to a family, what it did to mine, because that is the part that never appears in a court record, and someone should say it plainly. My name is Margaret, I am 67 years old, I am retired, 31 years as a secondary school librarian, if that tells you anything about how I approach the organisation of information. I moved to a rented cottage in a village in Shropshire 4 years ago, following my husband's death, to be closer to my daughter Claire and her family, who lived 12 miles away in a farmhouse outside Shrewsbury. The cottage had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that smelled of old stone and wood smoke, and a garden that backed onto a field. I paid £840 a month. I intended to stay for the rest of my life, or until my life required something different. I was, in the plainest possible sense, settled. The letting agency changed hands in the October of my 3rd year. The previous management had been quiet and responsive, the kind of operation that sent a plumber when you asked for one and otherwise left you alone. The new agency was managed by a man named Fraser. I met him once, at a property inspection he conducted in November unannounced, which was the first indication that something had shifted. He arrived at 9:10 on a Wednesday morning without prior notice, which is a violation of the minimum 24 hours notice required under Section 11 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985, as I subsequently confirmed with Citizens' Advice. I noted it. I did not yet understand how much I would need that note. Fraser was 41 years old. He had a manner I can only describe as pressurised, the specific energy of someone who has decided that speed and volume are substitutes for substance. He walked through my cottage in 8 minutes, made 4 observations about what he called property wear that I considered incorrect, took photographs without asking, and told me the landlord, a man who had recently inherited the property and had engaged Fraser's agency to maximise its return, was considering its future use. He said future use in the way people say a thing when they want you to understand that your position within that future has not been confirmed. I thanked him and closed the door and stood in my kitchen for a moment listening to the silence of the cottage, which is the kind of silence that only exists in the countryside and which I had, over 3 years, come to regard as one of the specific gifts of my life at that stage of it. Then, I opened my lever arch file and made the first entry. I want to stop here and ask you something directly. You have been listening to a retired woman describe a man who walked through her home without proper notice and made some observations about where. That is not, on its face, a horror story. It is an inconvenience, a minor breach, the kind of thing most people absorb and move past. So here is what I want you to consider. What if the inconvenience was not accidental? What if the unannounced inspection was the first move in a deliberate and sustained effort to make a long-term tenant's life uncomfortable enough that she would leave voluntarily, saving the landlord the considerable expense and procedural complexity of a formal eviction? What if Fraser had done this before, to other tenants, in other properties, and knew exactly how long it took to work? I did not know any of that yet. I only knew what was in the file. The campaign, and that is the word I have settled on because it is the accurate one, began in December. Fraser called the cottage landline on the 4th, the 9th and the 14th, each time to discuss what he described as the landlord's plans for the property, each time without providing any specifics. I asked, on each call, for anything discussed to be put in writing. Nothing was put in writing. On the 19th of December he attended the property again without notice. At 8:40 in the morning, I did not open the door. I photographed his car from the upstairs window and noted the time. In January, he began contacting Claire. I do not know how he obtained her mobile number. I had not provided it. I had listed her as an emergency contact on the original tenancy application 3 years prior, under the previous management. Fraser used that number to call her on the 6th, the 8th, the 11th, and 3 times on the 13th of January. The calls to Claire were framed as welfare checks. He expressed, he told her, concern about whether I was managing the property appropriately and whether my health and circumstances made the tenancy sustainable. He suggested, in one conversation that Claire relayed to me verbatim, that it might be in my best interest to consider a smaller, more manageable property closer to her family. Claire rang me after the 13th call. I want to be precise about what that conversation did to us, because it is the damage that does not appear anywhere in a legal record. Claire was frightened, not of Fraser, of me, of what Fraser had implied about my capacity. She asked me, carefully and with tremendous love, whether I was finding things difficult, whether I had considered that the cottage might be a lot to manage alone, whether I had thought about moving, and I heard in her voice, beneath the love, a new uncertainty about me, a question mark that had not been there before Fraser put it there, and I understood that this was what he had intended, to make my own daughter doubt me, to turn my closest relationship into a source of pressure, to weaponize her concern. That is the thing I cannot forgive. Not the calls, not the unannounced visits, that. I contacted Citizens Advice in Shrewsbury in the 3rd week of January. The advisor there confirmed that what Fraser was doing constituted harassment under the Protection from Eviction Act 1977 and potentially under the Housing Act 1988. She referred me to a housing solicitor named Judith, who operated from an office in Shrewsbury, and who had, it emerged, a specific and considerable familiarity with aggressive letting agency tactics in the Shropshire and Midlands area. Judith read the file, all of it. She asked me 4 questions, wrote down the answers, and said, "We are going to court." I appreciated the certainty. I was 66 years old, recently widowed, being systematically pressured out of my home. Certainty, at that moment, was everything. We filed a claim in the County Court for harassment under the Protection from Eviction Act, interference with quiet enjoyment of the property, and damages for the distress caused to both me and, through Fraser's deliberate contact, to Claire. Judith also sent a formal letter to Fraser's agency requiring all future communication to pass through her. The calls stopped, the visits stopped, the file, which by then ran to 47 pages, became evidence. Fraser's response, through his solicitors, was that he had been acting in the reasonable management interests of the property and the landlord, that welfare check calls to an emergency contact were a standard precautionary measure for elderly single tenants, and that nothing he had done constituted harassment within the legal definition. He used the word elderly. I noted that too. The hearing was in April, a Thursday. The courtroom in Shrewsbury was smaller than I had anticipated, a room of pale wood and low ceilings and the institutional smell of carpet that has absorbed a great deal of difficult weather. The judge was a woman named Christine. She had reading glasses on a gold chain and the particular stillness of someone who listens at a professional level. Judith built the case with meticulous precision, the call logs, the timestamps, the photographs of Fraser's car on 2 separate unannounced visit dates, Claire's written statement, which she had provided despite the difficulty of doing so, detailing each of Fraser's calls to her, and the content of those conversations. It was, as an evidential record, close to complete. Fraser's solicitor did not challenge the facts, he challenged the classification. His argument was technical, and it was prepared. He submitted that the Protection from Eviction Act's harassment provisions apply specifically to acts intended to cause a tenant to give up occupation of the property, and that the evidential standard for establishing intent, not the acts themselves, but the intent behind them, had not been met by the claimant. He argued that welfare calls to an emergency contact, however frequent, did not on their face demonstrate intent to evict. He argued that the unannounced visits, while procedurally incorrect, were documented as inspection visits rather than intimidation. He argued the pattern was consistent with overzealous property management rather than deliberate harassment. And then he produced a document, a training manual, internal, from Fraser's agency, distributed to all staff, dated 8 months before the campaign against me began. The manual contained a section on managing long-term statutory tenants who, like me, had been in a property long enough that their rent was below market rate and whose tenancies were difficult to end without considerable legal cost. The section advised, and I am going to be precise about this, a structured communication approach involving increased contact frequency, welfare flagging, and family liaison as tools for assessing tenant sustainability. Judith stood up immediately. Fraser's solicitor had produced this document as evidence that his client had followed an established internal protocol, that the behaviour was systematic and therefore non-malicious, procedural rather than targeted. He intended it to show that Fraser was following a system, not conducting a personal campaign. Judith argued the opposite with controlled, precise fury, that the document demonstrated the agency had deliberately constructed a methodology for pressuring long-term tenants, and that its existence proved not the absence of intent, but its institutional premeditation. Christine read the manual. She read it for 9 minutes. The courtroom was entirely quiet. The only sound was the heating system making a slow, regular tick, like a clock with something wrong with it. Her judgment was careful, and it was honest, and it did not give me what I needed. She found that the unannounced visits constituted a breach of statutory notice requirements and awarded me £480 in damages. She found that Fraser's calls to Claire were inappropriate and outside the scope of legitimate property management. She found that the training manual demonstrated a systematic approach to tenant management that she described in precise judicial language as deeply concerning. She did not find that the intent threshold for harassment under the Protection from Eviction Act had been met. Acquitted on harassment, £480 for the notice breaches. Judith appealed. The appeal is ongoing. I still live in the cottage. The landlord, through a new agent, has not pursued any further action, whether from legal caution or genuine change of intention. I do not know and have not attempted to find out. The garden backs onto the same field. The kitchen still smells of old stone and wood smoke on cold mornings. And when I stand at the window with the first cup of tea of the day, the silence is the same silence it has always been. But Claire and I are not quite the same as we were before January. We are close. We are careful with each other. The question Fraser put in her mind, the uncertainty about me, about my capacity, about whether I was managing, did not fully dissolve when the calls stopped. It softened. It is still there, occasionally, in the particular way she asked if I am alright. Not often, but there. The unexpected ally in this story is Judith. I want to be clear about that. She is 49 years old, and she took my case with a seriousness that I have thought about often since. The specific quality of being taken seriously by someone with no obligation to do so. She told me after the judgment that the training manual was going to matter. Not in our case, necessarily, but in the cases that follow. She had shared it with a housing rights organisation in Birmingham that compiles evidence of systematic tenant pressure tactics. She said it was already being reviewed. I don't know what will come of that. I don't know if Christine's finding of deeply concerning will become something with more formal weight in another courtroom, with another tenant, before another judge. I have put the training manual at the back of the Lever Arch file, behind the 47 pages of call logs and photographs and letters. It is tab 48. Here is the thing I want to leave with you. Christine found the manual deeply concerning. She wrote that in a judgment, a public document, and then she acquitted on the charge that would have given those words consequence. I have turned that over many times and I cannot resolve it. The concern was real. The threshold was not met. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and I do not know what to do with that. So, I want to ask you, if you had been Christine, with that manual in front of you and 47 pages of documented contact, and a retired widow sitting across the room who had watched her relationship with her daughter shift because of a letting agent with a structured protocol, where would you have drawn the line? Because I know where I would have drawn it. I know exactly where. And it would have been somewhere different to where Christine drew hers. The appeal continues. The file is on the shelf. The cottage is still mine, for now. The silence in the morning is the same.